This is Comic Shenanigans, episode 1083, a conversation with Chuck Austen and Pat Olliffe, creator commentary on Defiant, number 1.
Ain't no stopping them shenanigans. Love getting into shenanigans. All up in them shenanigans. 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 Shenanigans.
Welcome to the Comic Shenanigans podcast. I'm your host, Adam Chapman. This is episode 1083. It's another creator commentary episode. This time it's a conversation with Chuck Austen and Pat Olliffe. We're doing a creator commentary on Defiant number 1, their new comic that is coming out on March 11th. So we actually had this conversation a couple weeks ago, but I'm just putting it up now, just in time for the launch of the new book that they've worked on. They've obviously been working on a few books over the past years. They worked on The Tormented. They worked on Edgeworld, which is definitely a favorite of mine. So this is fun to be able to chat with both Chuck and Pat again. They've obviously been on the podcast a few times before together. The last time was episode 1033 back in March 2024. So 1 year ago, we were talking about The Tormented number 1. Now that is now wrapped. But that was a great book, and I'm hoping it eventually gets a trade format so I can put it on my shelf as well. Because I think I was buying it digitally originally. Anyways, this is just a great conversation with both Chuck and Pat. I'm always a big fan of talking to them about their work. Great creators, and they really have a great synergy together. You can tell that they really like working with each other, like what the other person brings to the table. They're really establishing a series of fruitful collaborations, and they're always quite enjoyable and fun to read. So I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Chuck and Pat, because I definitely enjoyed having them back on the show, because it's always nice to have them on as a duo, as a tandem. In terms of upcoming episodes, we have an episode coming up with Scott Dunbier, who's now with Act 4 Publishing, previously of IDW, working on artist editions and the like. We have a conversation about the upcoming slate of books that'll be coming from Act 4, both this year and next. In the next 2 episodes, we're going to be having a Book of the Month Club, a little bit something different because Daredevil Born Again is now on TV. We thought we would talk about something kind of related. So me and Nathan Struck are going to be sitting down, hopefully, that's the plan anyway, to talk about Daredevil Black Armor, the recent 4-issue miniseries, as well as Daredevil Batman, which was a one-shot that's collected in the Marvel vs. DC Omnibus that was from the mid-90s, and that was by D.G. Chichester and Scott McDaniel. And kind of a common through line there is that Chichester also wrote the Black Armor miniseries, and then on the following episode, we're actually going to have D.G. Chichester on the show to talk about working on both projects, set 30 years apart in terms of when he wrote them. So not set 30 years apart, but written 30 years apart. So I'm really excited to kind of get his angle on that. We originally talked to him last time, right before Black Armor had actually started coming out. So this will be kind of a nice bookend to that episode. And it'll be interesting. I'm excited. I kind of scheduled it in such a way that I'm going to have the Book of the Month Club episode first. So I'm going to talk about it with Nathan Struck. We're going to come up with some questions and on the fly, and as we have our conversation about these books, and then I'll actually be able to go right to the horse's mouth, so to speak, and talk to DG about what it was like working on those books, and be able to answer those questions. It's not often you get to read something and then immediately ask the person who wrote it things about it. So that's always fun. So thank you for listening to this episode as we talk with Chuck and Pat. You can reach me at comicshenanigans@gmail.com. Rate the show on Apple Podcasts, listen to us on Apple Podcasts, and also listen to us on Spotify. Thanks again for listening to the show and for supporting Comic Shenanigans. And as we're barreling towards episode 1100 soon. It's been quite a ride, hasn't it? Thanks again for listening, and enjoy the episode. Pat, welcome back to the Comic Shenanigans podcast.
Thanks, Adam. How are you, man?
Thanks, Adam.
I'm doing
Glad
well.
to be here.
This is actually the 3rd time we've done one of these joint calls with the both of you. This is Pat's 9th time on the show, and Chuck, this is your 4th time, so welcome back. It's always a pleasure. The last time you guys were on was last March 2024. We were talking about The Tormented. So I guess before we talk about the new project, can I ask you, as kind of a post-mortem, how was the full experience of The Tormented?
Oh, well, working with Pat is hell. You should know that.
That's
why you
why
keep
the
doing it.
name is that. The name has nothing to do with the actual story. It's a commentary on the working relationship. That was great. It was great. I mean, it was, I always liked that genre of story. And, it was an idea a germ of an idea that I had originally, and, Chuck was willing to kind of, flesh it all out and make it something actually real. And, it was great. I was super happy with it. Now, I don't know, I guess we're not really sure what the status is of whether or not it's going to get a graphic novel or a trade or not, but I was super happy with it. I thought it was I thought it was a success.
Yeah, actually, same for me. I loved doing it. It was not the kind of thing that I normally do, but I just loved it. Totally loved it. The hardest part actually was ending it. With a way to wrap it up after the 5. We could have kept going easily.
Now, it's interesting, and I can't remember everything from our conversation last year, but as you said, Pat, this was kind of more of a germ of yours as opposed to Chuck's. Was it an interesting then pivot to kind of, like, if you look at how this kind of plays out, that Tormented ends up being kind of sandwiched between more high concept sci-fi that Chuck has kind of brought together? Is it an interesting kind of deviation for you guys as a result, that you guys did get to try and do something very different in between these other, tonally as sci-fi out there kind of projects?
Yeah, I think so, because I think that it was because I even used a different style, a different artistic approach, because it was a different genre of story. But Chuck and I have been like tossing ideas around for years about different things that we wanted to work on together, or pitch ideas. So, of the 3 of them that have actually made it into the world, which, Edgeworld and Tormented and now Defiant, 2 of them obviously are science fiction based stories, but those, we had a whole bunch of different genre ideas that we've been knocking around for years. So it didn't feel that different or out of what we normally do when when we started it. It's just another project that we've been talking about for a while and gotten a chance to do.
Yeah, Defiant was I don't think we planned on doing another science fiction series necessarily afterwards, but when Chip got in touch with us and asked us what we had, he was clearly more interested in something that was along the lines of Edgeworld. Then Pat and I had talked about doing something that was a little bigger, a little more epic and spacey, and we had thrown around some ideas. So that's why I'm a little reluctant to say that this was mine and that was Pat's, because we've been batting this stuff around for quite a while, even while we were. It's just that when it came down to sitting down and writing it, he was in the middle of something else, and I was in a kind of a hurry up and get it pitched mode. Cause Chip was very excited about having us do something again. So I did, a lot of the writing, and he and I didn't get a chance to talk as much, but this one is really as much his as mine. It's just a total split down the middle, cause he came up with all those amazing visuals and so many of the characters and the way that they look and act. And it's really kind of whatever gets Pat and I going at the moment.
Right.
Before I transition totally into talking about the new book, I do one thing I really liked about how you guys kind of left the Tormented in terms of that, kind of the last book, particularly the last panel, is again one of my favorite visuals throughout. Is the therapist that the main character is talking to with the axe down her face, which is a really disturbing image, but a really compelling one at the same time. And there's just something about how you guys ended it where they're having this conversation, and then she's just like, well, then I'll see you next time, which is it's such an interesting combination of extremely threatening and also promise. And so, I do hope maybe someday you guys can do more with the Tormented, because it felt like it was almost like daring us to not have more. You'll see us next time.
Yeah.
Well, thanks. That's actually.
Well, there are more stories there. So.
Yeah. There's a lot more stories. We had a whole bunch of stories, and full graphic novels worked out for that thing. Each character would have their own individual sort of focus in various different arcs, and There are even scripts written that you guys haven't seen yet. So there's one thing that Pat and I kept trying to get into the first one, but it really never belonged there because it was so much Ryan's story, but it was kind of Opal's origin story. And it was, I kept taking those 3 or 4 pages and moving them from one script to another. And I don't think it fits here, Chuck. I don't think it fits. So there's a lot more that we would love to be able to do with it. And if we got you with that sort of multi-layered ending, then hurrah, success, because that's what we wanted. Yeah. That's totally what we were looking for, was that, there's a lot of different meanings layered into that thing.
Now, when you guys, so obviously you've had this working relationship working on these Comixology originals, and now you're working with Distillery. I'm curious where that connection really came about. Like, how did you guys get connected with Distillery?
Do you want me to tell that one, Pat?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Well, yeah, go ahead.
A lot of it came from just my knowing Chip for a really long time. I mean, he and I were buddies because we both lived in Glendale. And so, we would chat and hang out and talk and stuff. And he liked to grab lunch every once in a while with me because I was like the one comics guy who knew and understood comics, but I didn't talk about comics all the time because I wasn't really in it anymore. I was more in animation and film and whatnot. So he and I would always get together and talk about stuff. And every once in a while he would say, "Hey man, why don't you come over and do something for us at Comixology?" And I thought, well, I didn't really, honestly, wasn't really interested in getting back into comics, but there were some things about Comixology that I liked, the digital format and a lot of things that they're trying. I love being experimental. I like trying new things. So he was always asking if I would come around and do something. And then Pat and I keep talking about this, and now I've got the date down completely memorized. In 2017, Pat gave me a call, and he said, "Hey, let's do something together. I really want to do something that's like that I have a piece of that's mine, that I get passionate about." And I went, "Okay, for you, I'd do it. For you, I'd come back." So he and I, we started pitching ideas back and forth. We'd had some old ideas that we had done, and then we were talking to Chip at one point about just like helping us to get it into the digital format to sell through Amazon. And he said, "Well, did you know that we're starting up our own publishing division?" And I went, "I did not know that." So he showed me, he just happened to bring some of the flyers to dinner with him that night, and he left them with me. And so Pat and I started working on Edgeworld with an idea towards pitching it to Comixology. And after we'd gone through a few rounds, and I'd written a whole bunch of scripts and Pat had done a whole bunch of character designs, they bought it. And that kind of was the beginning of it. I think Pat and I we keep joking about this, but we hoped that we would get maybe 5 issues or 10 issues out of it. And that we at least get to say we did our thing. We finally did our thing together. Yeah. And it just kind of kept snowballing. Chip came to us after Edgeworld was doing well at Comixology, and he said, "Why don't we do more?" And I said, okay. So Pat and I started coming up with ideas. Tormented was one of them. There were a couple of others, but we could never find an artist that was interested in working with us or wasn't busy or, wasn't doing something else. So, we could never really get another project kind of out the gate. And then, they put Edgeworld, on a break for a while because they weren't sure if they're going to pick it up. And I said, well, what about this one? You're interested in Tormented? And then he went for Tormented. So then we were doing that. And then halfway through, he said, well, can you give Tormented to somebody else so Pat can go back and do Edgeworld because we want to do more Edgeworld? And so it started getting chaotic. And, but it was just one of those lucky things. And a lot of it really had to do with my relationship with Chip and my friendship with Chip. He's one of those guys who, he liked my writing back then. He likes it now. We just had a meeting a couple of nights ago, where I met with him and David Steinberger, the, co-owner of Distillery. And they were just telling us how much they love this book. And we'll see how it goes. It always depends on sales if we get to keep doing it. But for now, Pat and I are just ecstatic that we've been doing this for 8 years now,
Right.
Started off as a lark and, now we're like, I can't think of anything else I'd rather do than come up with concepts and ideas with Pat, to be honest.
Yep. I agree.
Pat, I'm curious.
Yep.
I'm curious on the artistic side for you, Pat. I mean, we've talked very extensively over the last few years when you were working on Edgeworld and also on the Tormented on how much you were training yourself to think differently about page turns, etc., because you were working in a primarily digital format, specifically something that had guided view as a way of kind of developing it. And so you had started, I always thought it was so fascinating how you would break it down and how it's almost like you had so many more page turns than normal because now you had panel turns. So when you're working on this new book and it's print again, did you retrain your, those muscles to go back to the way you were used to, or how did you find yourself laying out the pages and how you were thinking about panel composition and page composition?
Well, I think that knowing that it was a more traditional, quote unquote, traditional format, being that it would be in print as opposed to the guided view, online viewing that Edgeworld or Tormented was. It was certainly something that it didn't take me long to get back to the idea of laying out pages without guided view in my head, because that's how I've always worked. I mean, I've been doing this a long time. So it came back pretty naturally in terms of the layouts themselves. The only thing that was different was the distillery books are a larger format. They're bigger size. They're bigger size. So the page proportion is a little bit different. So you get to work with kind of a slightly larger format. So it affects how you want to display the panels on the page, how you get the eye to move around the page. And it's been nice because I think it's worked really well that we've had an opportunity to do a lot of like double page splashes in the course of this series, which gives me even more visual room to play around with. So in terms of the basics of it, those muscles didn't atrophy. I was able to kind of jump back in and I said, I remember how to do this. And the new thing was this slightly larger format of the distillery books.
It's interesting. So first of all, I mean, obviously it hasn't, as of this recording, the first issue hasn't come out yet. So I've been able to read the first issue, but only on like a tablet. So not really being able to experience that full format yet, although I'm excited to do so as I have pre-ordered the issue. So at least I'm one of those people. And when you look at the sales numbers later, at least Adam Chapman's one of them.
Well, good. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Adam.
What I did find was interesting, and hearing you talk about it makes sense, is that it did feel like you were able to expand in terms of the size of the panels and go back to some of those bigger spreads, because I guess that's one thing that doesn't translate as well when you are doing digital only, is that it doesn't quite have the same impact depending on how someone's reading it. Whereas you can really lean more into the more oversized panels here and really let the details sink in a different way. And so I felt like you really did a really effective use of that in this first issue. Not that you don't have moments of using more traditional grid panels, but you do. It felt like you were able to make better use of the space, especially for some of the. I'm trying not to spoil anything about the story necessarily, but some of the establishing shots and some of like the surprises, you're able to sink in those details differently. I hope that was coherent enough as a sentence.
No, it made total sense because I was like Chuck. I was really fascinated with the idea of guided view and online viewing and how to read a comic digitally, and I liked what Comixology was doing. But from a production standpoint, you were pretty limited into a grid format. You couldn't break through panel borders. You kind of had to stick to a certain format so that it could be used in guided view on digitally. And so not having that, even though I understood the value of it, and it was a storytelling challenge too. You really had to change the way you approach the design of a page to, instead of designing the page overall, how do I lead the reader's eye through the page? It was almost like each panel was a movie screen or a TV screen. Everything was encapsulated, the images, everything, the acting, everything was just encapsulated into each individual panel. You really couldn't break out of that or think about the page itself as a design element. Even though I knew eventually it would become a trade, that wasn't our primary goal. So as much as I understood the idea of that format, I was a nice change to kind of not have that constraint and to actually be able to take a larger view of the page overall, knowing it was going to be read traditionally, and being able to break panel borders, drop panel borders. It was nice to kind of flex those muscles a little bit.
Yeah, it's interesting looking through the issue, as you say, like it felt like you were really playing with the form because it's not, you don't just have standard boxes. Like they're different sizes, they'll shift on pages. Like it's interesting how it changes how you read some. I mean, I'm always interested in panel composition for this because like I think it's on page 15 or so, you have like shots of our main character and he's talking to someone else and you have the panel border kind of shifting as you go down the page as you start off at being, you know, the right panel is smaller, and then as we go down levels, they're starting to move over. Like it's an interesting stylistic choice, which I'm more fascinated by those choices because they have such an impact on how you read it, but I don't even know how I would put into words how you would even come up with that. So I'm saying you're a magician and I'm an odd.
Well, thank you, Adam. I appreciate it. So I also do kids parties. So it's just an extra way, an extra. I mean, to me, that's the great thing about comics and comic storytelling is that you do get to play with the idea of the page itself as a design element. How do I play with the panel borders? How do I get the reader's eye to move through the page like I want? So I'm glad that it worked for you, and I'm glad that I got a chance to play around with it a little bit. So as long as the story comes through and we hit all the emotional beats that we were supposed to hit, then we're good.
What I thought was so interesting is that, I mean, if you look at, I mean, it's easy to say like, oh, as you said, like this, you know, you're in the sci-fi space with both this and Edgeworld. It's interesting that when we look at our protagonists, they both obviously have this kind of haunted baggage. It's interesting, I thought, how Chuck manages to kind of express this stoicism in the main character here in the new book, and how Pat, you're able to kind of show that stoicism, and it's only near the end where you have that kind of veneer kind of get pierced that you start to show a little bit more of that humanity kind of peeking through. So I'm curious if you guys kind of had conversations about how to manage that level of stoicism to kind of keep him steely, but also when and how to kind of peel back the curtain a little bit to show that he is a little bit more vulnerable.
Well, at this point, honestly, Pat and I, we do talk about certain scenes or certain specific moments, but we kind of understand each other so well. And Pat is such a master of acting that I know that if I give him something in a script, he's going to double up on whatever I do. So he brings a lot of that stuff even without my having to talk to him about it. And even to the point where he'll sometimes come back to me and say, I think we could punch this up a little bit further and go more with it. So it's become a much more, in a lot of ways, I think more of a nonverbal, relationship as we've gone forward. I think we just understand each other a lot better about how that we both like what the other does, and that we just kind of adjust to each other pretty well. But at the same time, we did have, because this was so different than what Edgeworld was, we did have conversations about making use of the pages. Chip really wanted us to. He said, look, I know when I brought you into Comixology, it was all about the grid pattern, but this is like, we want Pat unleashed. And I said, okay, that's great as far as I'm concerned. We just want to make sure the story that we give you is something, really engages people. So Pat and I would talk about how to do what he wanted to do and at the same time give it emotional punch so that it meant something to it. It wasn't just eye candy. It was part of the story. So he manages to figure all that stuff out, make it really visually interesting and stimulating, and at the same time, stay really close and tight to what the emotional core of the story is. It's about a father, trying to find out what happened to his murdered son, and that's that he always knows that. He stays with it, and wherever he goes with it, whatever kind of weird bat alien creatures he has flying around in the background, it's basic story part of that stays front and center.
And you talked about the stoicism of the character and the softening as it goes by. And then to me, it's easy because, like Chuck said, we've worked together a long time now. I understand, how Chuck tells a story, and I understand he's so great at developing character emotions and developing character connections, both with the reader, but also within the characters' interactions themselves. And so when you read the script, it's easy to feel that development of a character, being able to reveal something a little bit more emotional on a fairly stoic character, because the development of the character is so organic that it's easy for me to kind of, to follow that path of character development than to know when to reveal something a little softer with a character who hasn't revealed something like that quite yet. So, I mean, it starts primarily with the script that Chuck writes.
I have a really silly question for you, Pat. But one thing I've always enjoyed, this is such a weird little tick. You do really good bearded people, like bearded men. And I know especially with Killian in the Edgeworld, there's just like, it felt like so much a big part of the character. Really helped add the world wariness to him. I'm curious when, and obviously this character does not have a beard, but I'm curious what kind of what is going through your head from a design sensibility when you are, casting a character in your mind and you do add facial hair, and how you use that to help tell a bit of the visual story on that person. Because I think in Edgeworld, in your main character there, it really did add an extra level, and you definitely played with how it kind of almost made him look sadder and more of like a hangdog look. And I think it fit that version of the character. And was there any thought of making this character in Defiant bearded as well? Apparently I'm just obsessed about facial hair. I'm just curious.
Well, the adding of facial hair to Killian was almost a kind of a happy accident, and I was just trying to come up with something different. I didn't want to do something that would be considered more traditional superhero or heroic lead actor face, where square jaw or even weathered expressions. But I wanted to try something different. I kept thinking, what could I do that would be different, that would actually add something to the Killian character? And it just kind of happened that way. I was just playing around with some facial hair. I had seen, actually, I can't remember how it all timed out. I think it was not long after, I think I'd seen The Revenant. And so that it became kind of like, well, that could be really interesting. And it's just one of those things where when you read, when I get a description from Chuck about who this guy is, and then you start playing around with different visual cues, sometimes it just, I had drawn a whole bunch of Killians without facial hair, and I thought, well, I mean, I guess that works. And then, but it wasn't until I added the beard, and it did give him that almost sadder kind of world weary feel immediately. As soon as I did it, I was like, okay, there he is. Just popped right in front of me. I said, okay, that's him. It clicks. So when I was designing Sandusky for this project, I knew that I wanted to specifically stay away from facial hair, because I didn't want to fall into a pattern where the visuals of the lead character in one book look too similar, too much like the lead character in the character of the previous book. I don't think I'm talented enough to actually be able to pull off the intricacies of different facial structures so that I could get away with two bearded guys that look distinctly different. I think both those guys were like, hey, those both look like Pat Olliffe drawings with beards. So I said, okay, I don't want to do that. So Sandusky, I think as soon as that was one of the first things about Sandusky is that, okay, no facial hair, cause I don't want to fall into that kind of, echo, of Killian.
In terms of, again, casting, a character that I really liked how you, figured out how they looked, and also how Chuck was writing, was, Tibby. Because that's a tough type of thing to do, to pull off, kind of a mechanical person, but you add so much depth to the eyes, like to or not necessarily eyes, you know what I mean? Like the, glowing eyes that show up. And there's just so much depth there, even though it's so simple and almost cartoony, but it also has so much depth to it. I'm curious, how many different iterations of Tibby did you go through?
Not many, because I think Chuck, he had a pretty specific idea because of the backstory of the character, that there wasn't a lot of different options. I mean, like I said, Chuck was had a pretty good idea based on her backstory, what she was going to look like. And he made some suggestions, and I kind of, I understood what he was talking about as soon as I saw the description of what he wanted. So I think we were kind of both on the same page pretty quickly. And once I knew what he wanted, it was going to always be in this area. Tibby was always going to be pretty close to what she looks like in the book. There wasn't too many extra designs that went on for that.
Now, who was the colorist? Actually, on the copy I have, I don't think there was any credits listed. I was curious who the colorist was.
What? That's crazy. Lee. It's Lee Lottridge.
Oh, it is Lee. Okay, because I know Lee obviously did Edgeworld. I just wasn't sure.
Yeah. And Tormented too.
Yeah.
Oh, that's right. Yes. So I'm curious, and this is it's actually partially a Lee question, but also a question for you, Pat. So obviously Chuck likes peppering flashbacks, and we've got a lot of flashbacks in Edgeworld. We've got flashbacks here, and you guys always tweak the colors of the flashbacks so that they resonate in a different way. They definitely hit differently. So we're very clear when we're reading them that we're reading a flashback, and it's not, current time. I'm curious, what kind of conversations do you have with Lee, to kind of develop a color palette so that it does set itself aside, but also has a specific look to it? I'm curious if you did have a conversation with Lee, or you just trust Lee to do their thing.
Yeah, I don't, I just trust Lee. At this point, Lee was the original colorist on Edgeworld, so he's, he colored all the Edgeworld arcs, he colored Tormented, he's doing this project. At this point, I trust Lee. I mean, he's a super talented guy, and I trust him to do his thing. So, I mean, when the colors come in, if I have any ideas or thoughts, I toss them his way, but those specific decisions, that's all him. He's great. So I just trust him to do his thing.
Question for you, Chuck, because it feels like sometimes I favor Pat too much with the questions.
It's okay. He's more charming than me.
I'm always a sucker for, really interesting character names. So Bran Sandusky, that's a very specific kind of way it kind of comes, mouthfeel in terms of, how the words kind of fall out of one's mouth. I'm curious because, they have very different feelings to them. Bran feels of a different era than Sandusky as a name. So I'm curious what brought you to that character name and that combination.
Well, it's weird. I actually don't know. I sometimes joke with Pat that I don't know where this stuff is coming from. I feel like I'm just channeling it because it just like pops into my head. And Bran Sandusky is one that just it just happened. At the beginning of this, when we were trying to, when Pat and I were first talking about this thing, there was a whole series envisioned. We same thing that we did with Edgeworld. We built the world and the universe, and we had all their backstories and their history and how they all related to each other. But the things like that, in a lot of ways, it really is. It's almost like the mouthfeel. If it feels good the way I say it, I just go with it. Like a name like Jexica, I honestly don't even know why. I was just looking for something that didn't sound like any of the other alien names that I'd come up with, and that just came in, and I liked it, and we ran with it. So I don't know, Bran Sandusky. I have a lot of friends named Brandon. Maybe that came from that. And Sandusky, I was definitely looking for that sort of older feel. And that's the one that came to me. It was just something that sounded, like the past. It doesn't sound like a contemporary name as much as it sounds like an older world name.
For sure. And I'm curious, it's interesting in terms of how you pace that first issue, because you do start with kind of I don't know if fun is necessarily the right word, because it does end up going in a more negative way in terms of what's happening to the characters. But you kind of jump into a situation, a diplomatic situation, and then you kind of, after the first 8 or 9 pages, then we move into really where you want to go, which is all about Bran having to potentially look for his son, try to find his body. So I'm curious how you were laying out, well, how do we jump into this world, get introduced to this character? What were you trying to achieve in those first, 8 to 10 pages before you really get started on the main thrust?
That's a great question, and I'm going to have to think about how I answer it without spoiling anything. So you've read the first issue, and
Yes.
you know that that there are lots of alien races in it, and in particular, there is an alien race. They get introduced pretty early on, so it's not really spoiling much of anything. That is sort of guiding all of this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I wanted to do was set up, first of all, like this just strange, bizarre situation where the characters were sort of dropped in and had to survive. And at the same time, they survived in a way that was completely unexpected. Like you don't expect after what happens initially that it's going to kind of go the way that it does with further diplomatic negotiations continuing on after that opening scene. And what I was looking for was to set up bringing together these disparate and unusual characters because there's how do I do that?
You're doing very well, Chuck. I'm very impressed.
Thanks. Because
All that CIA training is coming in handy right now.
oh, thanks.
There you go.
When the people come knocking at your door at 3:00 in the morning,
Right.
just go. But the idea is that it's a kind of a setup for things that happen later in the series, but not in the way that you might expect. It's not about the specific incident. It's about kind of the gathering of the people. Does that help? Is that enough of an answer to be thick and weird, but not give you any answers?
Well, I wanted to throw something else. I wanted to throw something else real quick too about you talked about the different, and I think this goes a little bit too when you were to the question you had for Chuck in terms of, planning out like those first 8 pages and how that sets up what happens next. And we talked a little bit before about the different format that Distillery has for their books in terms of page layout and size. The other different thing about the Distillery books is that, most comics 22 pages, and you have a beginning, middle, and end, and you have a certain arc you want to get through in that 22 pages. These are 44-page books, and I think that, and Chuck, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that changes how you move through the story in one issue. So it probably allows for a little bit more of time for scenes to kind of play themselves out and develop, because you don't have to be done in 22. You can take it out to 44. So I'm sure that kind of affects some of the storytelling choices that you make throughout the issue.
Oh, absolutely, it does. Yeah, you can start it off in a what seems to be a slightly slower way to really develop something out so that it has bigger punch at the end, because you just have so much freedom with 44 pages. It's great, and Chip is so terrific about pushing things to get the best emotional impact out of it and to tell the best story possible. Even, I don't know if he wants me to confess this, but he actually gave us 2 extra pages so that we could have one particular emotional moment. And I can tell you what it is without spoiling it. It's the discovery. The book that he gave us a special 2-page spread for that. And it made it, it made that whole scene. So they're really, that's the thing, is that they're really about exploring this format and sort of, letting the writer kind of slowly develop a story in a way that has, as much punch as possible. So it's been, you're right. Pat's absolutely right. You do approach it completely differently, and because the format's a little bigger and because I'm a total dick, I make Pat draw more panels for the page. So, yeah, he's got,
so you speak to the length of the issue. And so I did notice that, but part of me in my mind was like, well, it's the first issue. That must be why. Are every issue this kind of length?
Every issue is 44 pages.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. That's a whole lot of comic.
Yeah. It sure is. Because
I took it for granted because it was the first issue. And again, in my comic book trained mind, I'm like, well, first issues are often exercised. So that's interesting. I did not realize that. Yep. A question for you, Chuck, and this is kind of, I guess, a stylistic choice. As I was reading through it, I don't know if I expected to have the language, because obviously in Edgeworld there was language as well. And And so I'm wondering if that was more of like a conscious decision, or were you thinking like, well, these books are from mature readers anyway in terms of the content? Like, what was your thought process on specifically using, I guess, quote unquote, foul language?
The thought process was that Chip wanted, something that had a big, deep world similar to Edgeworld, but he didn't want it to be as dark or sexual or violent as Edgeworld. He wanted it to be more. I think he described it as like a 16 to 24-year-old range. And I said, well, what does that mean about language? And he goes, yeah, you can sprinkle some language in there. So it was something that was discussed up front about how far we would go with stuff. And I just stayed within those constraints. They never had any notes about removing any of it. So I assume I stayed within their constraints.
Interesting. One thing I really enjoy, I don't know if enjoyed is even the right word, but really responded to is you have Sandusky when he's talking to Tibby, and there's this one line where you say that because knowing ends hope. And I was just like, that's a really interesting. I thought that Chuck, that was a great piece of dialogue, but it did make me wonder, is that for you writing this character, given what happens in the first issue, I mean, is that almost like the thesis for the character, at least at the beginning, in terms of his outlook on life?
Yeah, it absolutely is. It's like he's, and you'll discover more about it as the series goes on. Like there's, Pat just finished an amazing scene in issue 2 that covers more of Sandusky's past, and but yeah, that was, that was kind of, in a way, that was where the character sort of built out of. It was the idea that he had this loss that he could keep sort of putting off because he couldn't get there because they didn't have the technology to get there, and now they have the technology and he's got to face it. And it's almost like this, it's the dark night of the soul. It's the crisis in your life that, supersedes all others, because now he has to go and he has to face it. So yeah, it was a big part. It was intended to be a big part of it. It was kind of the way that I've had studied 150,000 different ways to tell a story, and I've studied various different writing techniques, and all of them talk about how that's what you want, is you want your character to experience their dark night of the soul. So that's usually where I start, is what is that thing that they're going to have to face that is unlike anything else they've ever had to face.
What was interesting about that moment, and again, shortly thereafter, in the middle of that same conversation with Tibby, there's this, and again, to that moment that you speak of this kind of the dark night of the soul, when you have that moment where he's talking to Tibby, and then Tibby just looks at him and says, but Bran, you're not alive. And just for that moment, and then the look on his face, which is some great acting by Pat, of this kind of like what, and then Tibby kind of following up on that was an interesting counterweight to that because of that hope, that it's created this emptiness, because that's all he has to kind of lean on. I thought was a really strong kind of way of showing that character, but also what maybe he doesn't realize that Tibby's able to notice and to identify, which again is interesting because we're used to, this is a robotic character. However, it is able to pick up on something so human.
Yeah, very definitely. And there's obviously more to that as well. But yeah, if you really think about it, a lot of times humans just their sort of their natural emotional state is to avoid pain and to avoid suffering, even if it means that they're not living their fullest. And that was kind of what I wanted to get to, but in sort of like the strongest way possible. In this case, he's avoiding finding out what really happened with his son, and has been for like 10 years. So, but it's just such a natural thing, and it's actually something else that I'm exploring in Edgeworld now, is the idea of oh shit, I don't think I can talk about that. Sorry. But it's the idea that it's the concept of separation, the idea that people live not really knowing what the other person is thinking and what the other person is feeling, and how do you, and when you're dating, do you know if she's going to like you, if she's going to think you're an idiot, do you what, all of that stuff. And so instead of often doing the things that we really most want to do, we don't do anything. we just sort of keep ourselves held in limbo. So that's kind of where that really came from. That's the part that I wanted to explore a little bit. And not because I'm going through that. There's nothing.
To jump on that for you, Pat. So in that moment, and again, I mentioned the character acting that you gave Bran, but then right after that, you have this really haunting image of Tibby's face, but you have Bran reflected in it. And I'm curious how many iterations you may have worked on to get that looking just right.
Well, I think that it was one of those things where, like I said before, there's a lot of cues, obviously, that I'm taking, especially emotional cues and acting cues I'm taking from the script. So as the character develops and in the script, then he develops visually, he or she develops visually on the page. Same thing with their acting. So when I got to that point, I did play around with that panel quite a bit to try to figure out the best way to kind of get that emotional beat across, but have it, but with both of their reactions. And I think that, I think we had another reflection scene. I think Chuck had it in the script at one point. So it was another one of those things where you play around with a couple ideas, but then when you hit the one that works, it just jumps right at you, and you say, okay, this is the one that works. This is the emotional beat that we need. This is how I think it's the most effective way to get that across. So it just kind of popped right out there.
And
I have a question. Sorry, go ahead, Chuck.
Oh, it's okay. I was just going to say that, and that's one of the things that I love about working with Pat is that I didn't put that in the script. I don't have to ask for that, but to have him think about it. There was another scene similar to that in Edgeworld where Killian is looking at his reflection in one of those medical tanks, and only his reflection is his younger self. And I just love those moments because that's the thing about comics that's so great is when the picture tells the story and the words don't have to do anything. They can just be a side, because that's when you really get the biggest emotional impact from a reader. It's when they hit that visual thing, and it's like you can just sort of feel it seeping from your eyes all the way through your body as you go, wow, So that's when I just love when Pat does stuff like that.
Thanks. Question for you, Chuck. Given that, in the last three things you've worked on with Pat, you've had these darker characters or characters dealing with trauma of some kind. I'm curious, in comics, who is the happiest character that you've written?
I know. It's funny, but I've been craving comedy again lately. I mean, my whole life in animation for the longest time was comedy up until DreamWorks, and lately I've just been writing a lot of dark characters. The happiest character I ever wrote, I don't know. I'm like, it always winds up going, I think of Sammy the Fish Kid, and he was like this fun, upbeat kid, but his story was so tragic.
I think Dodge is a generally upbeat character.
Dodge is pretty upbeat, but she's hiding a secret that she's pissed off.
I understand. I understand.
Galen is the happiest character I've ever written.
There you go.
And Pat made him like, I can't even do it the way he does it, but it's like this like wonky, bendy, sticking his head in from the side of panels and stuff.
There you go. That was the answer. There you go.
Galen's my answer. What do I win?
Yeah, right.
All out of prizes today.
Less therapy.
Yeah. Is there something about this human darkness that why has it been something that's attracted you so much in the more recent things that you've been working on? Is it just, are you working through something? Should we call someone?
Yes. It'd be great if we had the picture. I would hold up a sign that says, yes, please.
There you go.
You kind of go through phases and stages. When I was younger, I used to do cartoon comic strips, and then I did comics about my son, which are all just like, silly, funny things that he did when he was little. And And then I don't know. After when Pat and I started working on stuff, I think I
don't blame me. Is that where this is going? This is not where this is going. This is my fault.
It's a downhill slide from here, Pat. Sorry. No, it was in deference to Pat. I mean, one of the reasons that we wanted to do The Tormented is because he has a more interest in horror, and I had to find that for me on Tormented that made horror work for me. And it was about the character, emotional trauma stuff. I guess just because it's so powerful and emotional. And for the first time, I was giving people my comics and they were reading them and going, oh my God. They were really affected. And I liked that, where I would show it to them before and they go, yeah, it's cute. And they would toss it aside, But in some ways, I think it goes back to some of the X-Men I wrote. One particular X-Men story that I wrote, and even the stuff that I did with Pat on the call, it had a sort of a darker tinge. And one of the stories that I hear the most about is when North Star fails. It's called Fall Down, Go Boom. And it's him trying to save a kid whose mutant power is exploding, but it's killing him. And he doesn't know how to get him to safety because he's too far away and he doesn't fly fast enough and the kid keeps blowing up in his arms. And I think it was like the first time that I'd really, that and War Machine, the first time I'd kind of gotten away from like kids programming and, censors and executives coming in and saying, yeah, you can't do this, so it was kind of freeing to be able to tell stories like this. But I think I'm getting to the point now where I kind of want to go a little lighter. I think I'm ready to go lighter again.
Does that mean we can't work together anymore?
So I can do fun. This actually. Well, that's true. Pat can do fun. One thing I'm curious about, and I'm curious what this shift seems to exemplify for you, Chuck. But it's interesting if you look at Edgeworld, you look at the Defiant, and you look at the Tormented, and you look at in each of them you have, if not outright a father, at least a father figure of some kind, having a very complicated relationship with the child. Now, obviously, in Edgeworld, Killian is a father figure, even if he doesn't necessarily mean to be, but it's because of circumstances kind of being thrust upon him. Obviously, in the Tormented, you have a very complex relationship between a child and his father, and his parents, I should say, but specifically his father. And obviously now we have another complicated relationship between father and son, in Defiant. And what is it about that relationship between a father and their children of some kind that has been such a theme in your most recent work?
Well, I mean, how deep do you want to get?
I bill hourly.
I mean, in some ways, obviously, the best stories come from personal experience in a sense. These are obviously science fiction stories, but there's a real personal element to them. But, Edgeworld has a lot of stuff in it that echoes things that I was going through in my life after my divorce, so the S-MAP coming down and hitting and taking away his wife and his child and his unborn baby is like, that's how I felt. I felt like my whole family just kind of got obliterated off the map. So you write about that stuff in a way that makes you feel like you kind of got control over it and that you can write a conclusion to it, that you may not have felt like you had satisfactorily in real life, I think. So, I mean, if you really want a real serious answer, that's kind of, what you do. And it's like, I did go through, we talked about this before, I think, Adam, is that, I went through some therapy for child abuse when I was younger and that stuff it does sort of stick with you and you try to find ways to deal with it. But one of the common things is what Ryan was going through. It's like, can I ever be a functioning member of society again? Can I be around people and not, lose my temper, freak out, whatever? And yet, you do your thing, you get therapy, you try to work through it and you can. And that's kind of where it always goes. I mean, the weird thing about these books is because we haven't really gotten to any conclusion that Pat and I wanted to yet. They end up happy. The characters do wind up in a good place because that's kind of where I like to see. That's my worldview. I do believe that you can kind of get through this stuff and and life can be good. But we're just sort of in the early dark phases of everybody's life. So, I don't know. I think in some ways the stuff that you sort of deal with, that's what gives you the ability to sort of find that emotional gut punch on the page. And, that's kind of what I want. I think I think Pat feels the same way, but everybody who's read the outline for Defiant and where it's going, it's just like, they're all in, and they're totally all in. So, same, I think, with Edgeworld. Pat knows what the ending to Edgeworld is, and we talked a little bit about the Tormented, but it really as dark as they can be. It's always about being hopeful. I mean, in the end, Ryan. Not to spoil anything for anybody who hasn't read it, but Ryan and Opal wind up in a place where I think they're going to be able to work through stuff. We'll see where Sandusky ends up. Killian ultimately, he figures his life out in a way that I think is unexpected. So, I don't know. Does that answer your question? Because I feel like I'm talking now.
No, it does. It does. I'm gonna throw a question at Pat now. I'm curious, Pat. I mean, a lot of people who they see your name, in their mind, they kind of close their eyes and they think of, hoo-ha, classic Marvel action or, classic superhero action. And obviously in these projects, you've really been able to challenge yourself and go in different directions, that are, kind of a far cry from the more standard superhero fare, but really allow you to show your deep character work, show your ability to really lay out pages and do, this strong character work while also doing, these bigger science fiction, kind of ideas. How has that journey been for you? And it must be nice at the same time that when you're working on these projects, but you do have, robust commission lists, and a lot of them skew to, towards those hoo-ha action characters. Is that kind of a nice balance for you to that in the middle of this, more serious introspective take on these characters, that you also do get to throw in a Spider-Girl here and a Spider-Man there and et cetera?
Yeah, I think so. I think too that I think jumping back was, when Chuck talked about that, I'd given him a call and I was interested in trying something that would be creator owned and something that would be different. And part of that was in a response to, that a lot of the projects and I'm happy to have them. I mean, I loved my time on Spider-Girl. I love my time on Untold Tales of Spider-Man and Hawkman. And so, I love that genre and I loved working on those characters. But I was looking to do something a little different. And, now I did get a chance to do some things were a little bit different. That I got to do, something like Barbed Wire for Dark Horse, that wasn't a straight superhero book, and, Samson. And so I think that where I got little taste of it, and primarily, I guess the big one was Rough Riders for Aftershock. It was a non-superhero. Of course,
book. Yes.
Yeah. So it's, so once you get a kind of a taste of those projects, and I'd like to experiment a little bit more with this. But I don't always have that opportunity to do that within, certainly like a Marvel or DC. So that was part of the impetus for me to reach out to Chuck and said, maybe we can, try to do something creator or something a little bit different. What specifically we get a chance to tell these kinds of stories. So in terms of balance, I've been very fortunate in that, I'll have some commissions that have come in that are more traditional superhero oriented, like a Spider-Girl or Spider-Man or something. But then occasionally during this process, while we've been working together, I've been able to pick up a couple projects that, Secret Wars Battle World with Tom recently, which is, all about hoo-ha traditional superhero action. And, I did a Star Wars project, which was, science fiction, but in a different way. So I have been able to pick up, have been able to do different things to give me some kind of balance. Keep my toe into that genre a little bit. So it has been nice. But I'm very happy exploring the stories that Chuck and I have been doing over the last bunch of years. It's very rewarding. It's, I just like to continue.
I'm curious. I'm always curious about when I talk with you and also with Ron Friends, about any particular off the wall commission requests recently.
No.
Like I've talked about this with Ron before. Is one, I'm always impressed by the things that people ask for. Ron and I have gone back and forth a few times where I desperately want to get a commission from Ron. However, I am racked with indecision on what to ask because I'm like, I'm just such a fan, and I've talked with him so much about a lot of his work that it's really hard for me to be like, well, what do I even want him to do? And he's like, Adam, I get it. I've worked with, Sal Buscema for years, and I don't know what I would ask Sal to draw. And I'm like, okay. Right. Like, he gets it. But, like, sure, it's one of those things. So when I see people asking, I'm like, oh, man, that's such a great idea. Would never have thought of that. So I'm always very envious of those who, can put their money where their mouth is and come up with a really interesting idea and get you or Ron to, bring these things to life.
Well, I haven't had anything unusual lately. The most unusual commission I was ever asked to do was Captain America grilling hot dogs at a grill. I don't know why Captain America grilling was something that this person wanted. I was happy to do it, but it was the most, when I did get that description, I went, all right. I've never had that happen before. So, that would have been my one commission that would have been kind of more outside the box thinking a little bit.
Well, that is great. I remember you mentioning that before, Pat, and that still makes me laugh. So thank you for that.
Yep. That's a good one.
I'm going to let you both get back to your evenings in a moment. Are there any final thoughts? Do you want to mention about Defiant, which is about to come out? I believe it's coming out on I want to say March 11th or 12th. Am I right there?
I don't have a date. I think that sounds close.
Yeah. Somewhere in March.
I sure hope so, because this episode's coming out on March 8th, so I'm hoping it comes out on March 11th or 12th or so.
You probably know more than we do. I don't think the only thing I would say is that I think, and we've kind of hinted at it in the conversation this evening, is that when we talked about the story and talked about promoting the story, and I think one of the things that Chuck threw in there was, bring your Kleenexes, which is, I think which I think is pretty accurate, because I think that, I don't know. Both in Edgeworld and Tormented, there was a lot of emotional beats that, we explored. But I think to a certain extent, I think this one has been the most emotional, I think, from a character standpoint, of any of the ones that we've done. I don't know if Chuck would agree, but there's a real depth of, dealing with loss and, that kind of character interaction that, and it's not, I don't want to give the impression that it's some depressing journey. We've got a lot of, exciting action stuff, science fiction stuff in it, but, I think there's a lot of emotional depth into Defiant, that I think readers will get a lot out of. Yeah,
I think that covers
thoughts.
I think Pat nailed it. I think that covers it pretty well. We got 44 pages, and we did our best to pack it as full as we could with stuff that would entertain people and hold their interest and be memorable for them. Hopefully we succeeded.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, judging by the first issue at least, so far you have, and I'm very excited to read additional issues. It was a really good start.
Oh, awesome. Thanks.
Thank you.
It's an interesting thing, because it's like one of the, I don't want to be talking out of school too much, but a couple of the guys at Distillery, they were all saying how it it made them cry, or almost made them cry. But one of the other things that they talked about was this world just spurred their imagination so much, because there was so much depth to it, and so many alien species and weird science fiction worlds and concepts and story ideas, and it was not something that I had thought of. This is just me and Pat telling a specific story. But one of the things that we were able to do with it was sort of this sense of awe and wonder that I don't remember seeing in a comic for a very long time, at least not for me. So there's that aspect as well. Aside from the bringing Kleenex, it's also it's there's a lot of stuff in here. There's a lot of imaginative, fun, crazy stuff in this thing.
I guess one question I haven't asked, but what is the projected length, or how much do we think we're getting, at least at the beginning? Because, I mean, obviously in your previous works, it usually was, 5 issues or so was the kind of initial season, so to speak, and then we got more. Like, what's the initial plan for Defiant?
Well, Defiant there's definitely 3 issues, and then it comes to I would call it a satisfying conclusion. And the history of the characters and the depth of the world is such that, well, I mean, the way that it came about was when Chip asked us to come to him, I didn't know what he was asking for. I thought he was just talking about, like we discussed here before, like you were just saying, Adam, like a, traditional 22-page comics series. And so I pitched him, here's 10 story ideas, and here's where we'd like to end it up. And he got back in touch with us and said, this is great, but just tell me the last best story, because we only have 3 issues. And I went, oh, okay. So we approached it from there, but there's tons more to tell. If people enjoy it and it sells well, we could definitely do more. There's no question about it.
Plus, as you guys have said, I mean, we're getting, 40 pages of story. I mean, 3 issues is like 6 issues. So,
yeah.
I mean, you're not lacking for content in that perspective.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
Well, again, thank you so much to both of you for coming back, and it's a lot of fun to be able to talk to you guys again, and I'm really excited to see more Defiant when the second issue comes out in a few months. So thanks so much again for taking the time to chat with me today.
Oh, thanks for making the time. Thanks, Adam.
Always a pleasure, Adam. Always a pleasure. Appreciate it.